Next speaker is Noemi, who'll talk about grant funding.
Okay, thanks, Ignacio. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So this is, for those who participated on the webinar workshop yesterday, this is a follow-up to that conversation where I discussed all of EPA's brownfields grant funding that was available. Ignacio, if you can move to the next slide. So yesterday I talked about the various grants that we had. For those who might not have been on the webinar or workshop yesterday, I just wanted to run through. These are the various grant types that we have. The ones that are highlighted in green and have yellow print are the ones that will have the request for applications coming out shortly. So we expect those to come out at the end of August. And so this presentation is really going to focus on how to gather your materials to be able to be successful to apply for this funding. And so for those who did listen in, these are the type of grants that Wai from HART and Tim from City and County of Honolulu, and then Ruby talked about one yesterday, the Brownfields Revolving Loan Fund. It will not be as part of this request for applications in August, but it will be available the following fall. So if you're interested, you could start gathering information now. So can you forward to the next slide? So I first just wanted to give you an example because we get questions all the time. Well, what kind of sites is it that EPA is looking for? There is no site in particular. What we're really interested in is providing funding to you for you to identify what kind of sites would be best for this application. So this is an example in the city of Tucson, Arizona. This is right adjacent to their downtown Tucson area. And for those who have been to Tucson within the last, let's say 7 years, their downtown area has changed dramatically. This area is right adjacent to downtown. So they're really trying to focus on their central business district and trying to bring it up to a nice reuse that would match going into their downtown area where they've put in a lot of work. Next slide. So if you are considering applying for an application to US EPA, what I would ask you to consider first is if your entity were to get a grant, who would oversee that grant? Is the vision that you have shared for the redevelopment or cleanup in your community, is it shared by the various partners that you have? How and when will you engage the community? This is public funding, so we want to ensure that if we give you resources, that it's something that's being shared with the larger community. And do you have the political support to make this happen? If you are planning to apply for the assessment grants that Wai and Tim talked about, where they were doing all of these phase 1 and phase 2s, if you're planning to do it on private property, do you have the right approvals to be able to obtain access to their properties? And then just more importantly, have you engaged your local regulatory agency if you're planning to do cleanup, or in this instance, it would be the HERE office, the Hawaii Department of Health, all of the presenters who have been talking to over the past 2 days, making sure that you engage them, specifically Melody. Next slide. And so just thinking about kind of grant writing in general, some of the basics that you really should do is just review the material. So the first thing is we've talked a lot about Ignacio and the Center for Creative Land Recycling being able to provide support. There's another entity at Kansas State University who has a similar role like CCLAIR that has developed a system called TAB-EZ, where within TAB-EZ, if you answer a series of questions that are within this database, it will spit out an application for you. But also within this TAB-EZ, there are former successful applications that have been written by individuals who have applied for these same grants, so you can get an idea of what an application like this might look for. Again, it's grant writing, even though you're applying for funding, so you really should tell a story. Keep the story detailed and consistent, and then areas where you're not sure, is this eligible, is it not eligible, make sure that you contact EPA, which would be me. Contact me if you have any questions about any of the threshold criteria you read, or to even determine if the site that you want to clean up is actually eligible for our resources. Next slide. And so kind of keeping in that mind with proposal preparation, that the thing I'd like you to think about is, what is your project development? What is it that, think about if you were to start a new business, what is it that you're trying to sell to someone? So if you want me to give you funding, consider, I'm a funder, tell me what it is that you're trying to do. So really think about what your project is and trying to hone in on what the story is you're trying to sell. So for instance, with YE and Heart, it was easier for them because they could say, we're trying to build this new light rail, and so we need to buy up these properties to be able to put the rail alignment in. She had a great story to be able to tell why the environmental assessment money was needed. The same thing for City and County of Honolulu, focusing on the transit-oriented development, the sites that were around the light rail, trying to build more TOD development. So just think about what the story is that you want to tell, and start building that project. Do you have a catalyst site that you can carry through as an example in your application? Is there one site that you could say would be the catalyst? If that site is redeveloped, then it'll help with redevelopment in the larger area. Think about how you've involved the community and how you will continue to build on that, and what are some of the creative outreach methods you'll have to do for community outreach. Given COVID and the restrictions that we have right now, in writing the application, you really have to be creative and talk about how you would engage the community if there are, strict shelter in place or restrictions put on how many people could gather at one time. And then, as always, just think about what is the big picture. Oftentimes in planning, I say start with the end in mind and then work your way backwards. And those are the things that you would consider when writing the proposal or application. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of projects that have been very successful and used quite a bit of our funding from US EPA. This National City is in California. It's just south of San Diego, right before you get to the border of Mexico. As you can see there, if you just look beyond that picture, the Pacific Ocean is there. But this is a creek that runs up next to this development project, which is 201 units of affordable housing. And this entire area, the community, is really what pushed the city of National City. This used to be a huge transportation yard owned by the city, and the city used a lot of their funding to clean up this site to be able to build this affordable housing. Next slide. These are some pictures of the completed affordable housing project. They have a huge kind of community center within the housing project. Next slide. And these are some pictures more. They have a nice big playground. You can see they have a big courtyard open area. They have a really nice computer lab where they were able to receive some private foundation money to get that built for the residents that are there. They used from US EPA, they were successful in applying for an assessment grant. They used revolving loan fund grant money, and they also received technical assistance from US EPA to help make this project even more green than they had initially set out to do. A lot of it with green building, as well as some of the greening around some of the restoration of the local creek there. Next slide. So in thinking about, this is all about applying, these grant writing tips could be for any type of application, but I'm specifically referring to US EPA's Brownfields grant. So in that, ask that you really read the entire guidelines. We have a whole almost 42 pages of frequently asked questions. It's an electronic file, so you can do a find and search. If you're looking for eligibility, you can look up every question that's been asked on eligibility and be able to receive your answers. You have to address all of the information. So of course, federal government kind of strict, that oftentimes we will ask you a question and there's an and in between. If there's an and, that means there's two questions. If there's an or, it means you can answer the information before or the information after. And so just be really careful that you address all of the criteria. There are a couple of proposal checklists that we keep on our website. I would recommend that you also use those, but most of all, ensure that you get your application written in advance and you contact Ignacio to have him review your application. His wife is a school teacher, and let me tell you, he will bring the red pen to your application for sure. Next slide. So I just wanted to share with our grants, we have what are called threshold criteria, and we have ranking criteria. If the threshold criteria is either pass or fail, there's anywhere from 4 to 6 criteria that you have to meet in threshold. ranking criteria is where you're actually ranked and kind of scored on what you write. And these are the 4 main ranking criteria areas that you would need to address in your applications. Next slide. And so this is that free TabEZ tool that I was talking about earlier. You can access it anytime. It's completely user-friendly. It's password protected. So I definitely recommend, even if you're not planning to apply, you're just thinking about it, this will give you a good idea of what the applications and what material you would need to pull together if you are thinking about applying. Next slide. And so I would just say, as part of preparing for that, just participate in any EPA webinars. We will have, as soon as the guidelines are out, shortly thereafter, probably 2 weeks after, we will have a webinar where we go over all of the criteria extremely in depth. I would say definitely participate in that. And because it is a government system, and given that everyone is likely still going to be working from home or remotely working, that just be sure that you have your application to submit 1 week before the actual deadline, just to make sure no systems crash or anything like that. Again, have CClear review your application. And it's always good, I find, that when you are so familiar with the information and you write something up, you're so used to seeing things that you may not notice errors, that it's good to get someone outside of your department to possibly review the application for you. Next slide. So in thinking about what those 4 ranking criteria are, one of the biggest things, of course, that's public funding. So we want to ensure that there is community need. So really think about who your sensitive populations are, what brownfields impacts there are in the community and how it relates to your sensitive populations, and then just what are the social impacts. You know, are these brownfield sites, are these underutilized sites, are they being used for illegal dumping? Is it creating crime? Is it lowering your tax rolls? Just a variety of things. These are the things you need to think about in being able to demonstrate your community need. Next slide. So here's an example of a project with a tribe that we're working with in Nevada, and they had a former, what they would call an informal auto maintenance shop, and they were really interested in kind of this auto maintenance repair facility just kind of popped up. It wasn't permitted or cited to be used for that purpose, but it was being used for that purpose. So they used some of our resources to assess and determine what the contamination was at that site, because they're looking to redevelop it into a much larger open space and community gathering. Next slide. And so the other thing you need to think about is what partners will you have? Not just, you know, obviously one of your partners has to be, because we dictated that would be the HERE office, the Hawaii Department of Health, not just to oversee your cleanup, but to also help you with any assessments that you might be conducting, ensuring that you're doing it following their protocol so that you can get the best information, have the best use of the resources that we're providing to you. Also working with any type of community development agencies who can help you further pursue your redevelopment, such as the planning department, like where Tim works, if you're in the city and county of Honolulu, or wherever that might reside in your local area. And if you're a nonprofit entity, or even if you're a unit of government, what private developers are you bringing in? What local businesses do you need to consult? Are there any church or nonprofit organizations that you should be considering? Talk about those partnerships, because it's extremely important in applying for these resources. Next slide. And then, of course, leveraging the resources that we provide. As you saw yesterday, the money doesn't go above $1 million. It can be anywhere from $200,000 all the way up to $1 million. And so for most projects, that is not going to get you all the way through cleanup, through your planning, and through your redevelopment. So you have to have other resources, and so we call that leveraging. So we're really looking for you to identify in your application what other sources of local, public, or private are you planning to kind of combine with our money to make sure that the project gets all the way through to its intended vision. Next slide. And so I get asked this question a lot. Can we apply for just one site? Does it need to be an area? You decide that. If you need the resources just for one site, or if you need it for an area, then talk about what that is and talk about where the need for environmental site assessments are. Make sure that you have in your application relevant commitments from your stakeholders, because we do ask for you to list not only the name of the organization, but the individuals within that organization, and also contact information. Ensure that you have property owners already on board so that you can get access to those sites. And then really in the application, remember, you're telling a story. So talk about what that planned vision is for redevelopment. Even if you're unsure of when that redevelopment is going to happen, if you have a vision plan for it, then tell us about that. Next slide. So for the cleanup grants, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, so I just want to hone in on it because it's extremely important that in applying for a cleanup grant, whether you're applying for one site or multiple sites, you have to ensure that you are the owner of that property. In a multi-purpose grant, you have to talk about at least one site that you do own in order to be eligible for that grant. You have to have a phase 2 that is fully completed and done before you can apply for the cleanup grant. You also have to have that analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives, the APCA, that talks about the cost estimates in order to apply for cleanup. We are, as I mentioned, asking for what other leverage resources you have for the redevelopment, and just ensuring that you actually do have a vision for redevelopment, that you have some type of redevelopment plan. So we're not just cleaning up a site, that you are cleaning up and getting the site reused. Next slide. So this is an example of a project in Crescent Mills, California, just to show you that it can be small sites or it can be very large sites. This is a former lumber mill site in Northern California. The Sierra Institute for Community and Environment has received several cleanup grants from US EPA. They're a nonprofit organization, and they're working on remediating this site right now. Next slide. So kind of just in talking about applying, just make sure that you use an active tone. Individuals that are going to be reviewing your grant, it's the same way as if you were trying to sell something. Stay away from things such as I'm considering, I may be, I intend to, and say I will. This, use very active tone when you're writing the application. Short, direct sentences or organizing them into bullets is a great way. Remember, staff have to review this, so the quicker you can get to telling your point, probably the better you are. Be direct, don't have the reader guess. Understand that people who are reviewing this application may know nothing about Hawaii, may have never visited Hawaii. It could be someone in Boston or in Florida that's reading your application. Minimize or explain any acronyms and try to stay away from vernaculars. Use any tables or kind of light shading or different fonts such as italics, underlining, or bold. So it gives a variety within the text so when people are reviewing it. Next slide. And so this is just more kind of specificity around applying for our grants. There is a narrative information sheet that is 2 pages that you'll need to put together. It cannot go beyond 2 pages. If it goes beyond 2 pages, they'll pull out that extra information. You also need to have a state acknowledgement letter. It does not count towards the 2 pages of the narrative, but you'll need to get a letter from Melody from HDOH that would be attached to your application if you're applying. And then the narrative and telling the story of what I've talked about. If you're applying for an assessment and cleanup grant, your application cannot exceed 10 pages. For a multi-purpose grant, it cannot exceed 12 pages. Any excess pages that you have, it will be removed. And just say, remember that you're entering these pages through a system. And what happened last year was there was oftentimes, because of formatting, there were paragraphs that got pushed onto another page once it got transmitted, and those were eliminated because it added on to another page. So just make sure that when you're uploading your applications, put it in PDF form so you'll know kind of what the page number is before you upload it. And then just remember to limit any attachments that you might be passing along with your application. Next slide. And so this is just a submission for those who are not familiar with applying for federal funding. Most federal applications that you apply for has to go through the grants.gov system. So the grants.gov system has its own requirements. It has nothing to do with EPA. So if you have challenges with grants.gov, it's not something that EPA can help you with. It's a larger government system, which is why we ask that you have your application written a week in advance. There's hyperlinks when this presentation is sent out so that you can get directly to the grants.gov tip sheet, as well as our frequently asked questions. And again, this is just kind of laying out the attachments that would be required when you're submitting your application into grants.gov. Next slide. And so just a couple of tips in terms of applying through grants.gov. Make sure that you have your correct organization's DUNS number, as well as your SAM number. It is registered and it is active. Not only that it's active, but that it will be active by the deadline of you applying. We've had people, because there's 60 days, the guidelines will come out, someone will start working on their application, and then their SAM expires right before they're supposed to submit in grants.gov. And to get your SAM kind of re-registered, I think that can take up to 2 weeks. So make sure that you know in advance before you start writing the application about your SAM. And apparently, in order to get your SAM number fixed or to even talk with them, you have to ensure that you have the correct authorized organization representative, which is called an AOR, who submits that proposal and asks for any changes in grants.gov or SAM. Next application, next slide. And then just lastly, this is my contact information if you have any questions. If you are interested in applying, I would encourage you to participate in the much longer webinar that we'll have that'll go through all of the criteria. And so there was a question about proof of insurance. It went away. I didn't see that, Ignacio.
Oh, no, that was something else. But
Okay.
Diana with DOH mentioned that they might apply for a multi-purpose grant. So Diana, if you're online, perhaps you can ask Noemi directly while I tee up my presentation and a poll.
Sure, yeah, State of Hawaii Environmental Health Administration was awarded the fiscal year 2020 multi-purpose grant generally, and then we applied within for this particular project as a joint project between our solid and hazardous waste branch, our wastewater branch, and the HERE office. So we're just—
Okay, so Diana, so that's a different multi-purpose grant.
Oh, got it.
So that
okay.
multi-purpose grant is a larger US EPA multi-purpose grant. This multi-purpose grant that I'm talking about is a specific brownfields multi-purpose, which probably doesn't do us any justice with us both having a grant that's called the same thing. But this one is specific to brownfields multi-purpose. That other multi-purpose is a much larger, covers about 15 different statutory authorities that can be used with that funding. This is strictly just brownfields multi-purpose. So sorry about that. I should have said that up front.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for the clarification. I think that helps.
Sure.
All right. All right. And thank you, Noemi. And we'll have time for actually a few questions, but we're going to have a few polling questions for you to answer.